After losing the Vietnam War, President Nixon needed something to get the people back on his side during his presidency. He declared another war, except this war was much different. He labeled drugs public enemy number one and declared the war on drugs. However, from many people's perspective, this was just another loss that President Nixon gave us with lifetime consequences. Hundreds of thousands of people all across America die every year from drug overdose. Nixon's war on drugs was also targeted through many groups through the Racial Projects 1 and 2. The government was able to barge into all homes where they had suspicion of drugs. I had first heard about this through America at War, a class I took in high school, but after researching, it's obvious to see that the government was able to go too far, and it's obvious to see that the war on drugs was lost. Firstly, I wanted to talk about the war on drugs and how it affected all Americans. Secondly, I want to talk about prisons and how much money we have spent throughout the war on drugs. And lastly, I want to talk about the current drug use in America. In June of 1971, President Nixon announced and put into effect the war on drugs. This was to stop the growing drug use. However, it mostly just took jabs at certain groups of people. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, said that the war on drugs had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. He also said we could arrest their leaders, raid their houses, break up meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. The war on drugs enabled the government to make changes to force their way into the homes of all Americans. However, they mainly focused on arresting and raiding the houses of the lower class to keep the streets clean. If someone close to Nixon knew about this, then why were Americans not able to stop this? Around this time, Americans had the left and the right, and the left was supportive of world peace, and the right just wanted to keep fighting. So Richard Nixon did the war on drugs to bring more attention to him and make him look like a good leader. In my class, we learned that the major drug that the government went after was marijuana. They went after this because it was cheaper and mostly found in urban areas. However, the Jews supported making marijuana legal everywhere, so they went under fire too from the government. Tim Dickinson brought up a quote that Nixon said during an Oval Office meeting, and excuse my language. Every one of the bastards that are out there for legalizing marijuana are Jewish. By God, we are going to hit the marijuana thing, and I want to hit it square in the puss. By taking out what people who dealed marijuana, the Jews couldn't gain any leverage in voting to make marijuana legal. Even today, after countless research into marijuana, many states still haven't legalized it. They still abide to Nixon's thought process and laws about arresting everyone regardless of the drug or the amount. One thing, however, that's not talked about enough is how President Nixon was trying to copy off what the Britons had succeeded. In the article, Has a War on Drugs Ever Been Lost?, author Mike J. argues that the war on drugs in Britain was successful. He states that the Dangerous Drug Act of 1920, which targeted cocaine and opiates, was directed at the problematic groups such as deviants, bohemians, and ethnic minorities. However, in the U.S., Nixon decided to target the more obtainable drugs and street drugs like weed, which almost directly targeted the black community and not everyone as a whole. He thought he was going to be able to pull off what Britain did, but instead, we still faced the consequences. Due to Nixon placing such harsh laws, there arose another problem that we still face today with imprisonment in the United States. With all the arrests made, this left our prisons overflowing, and people started to question who should be in jail and who shouldn't. The rapid rate of people going to jail started to overcome the government and taxpayers. Raymond Rosas talked about in his article, he talked about the Racial Project number 2. He talked about the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1886 and saying how it secured funds for studying how existing federal buildings could be converted into prisons. So basically, instead of reforming policies that were put into effect 10 years ago, they decided to build more prisons, which basically means that everything would stay the same now, except we were able to handcuff and arrest more and more people and put them into jail. Taxpayers were not happy with this, as they didn't want to keep paying for prisons, and they weren't happy with finding out that a prison could now be put right next to them without any warning. The government wanted to get the message across that drugs were still public enemy number one long after Nixon's presidency. Jelani Exum states that in the 1980s, President Reagan created a multi-agency federal task force and enforced anti-drug spending from $645 million to $4 billion. She also later stated that by authorizing the use of reduced bail options and increasing pretrial detention, the legal shield for discriminatory punishment was strengthened. Even after Nixon's presidency, we continue to go down the spiral of spending more and more money to target drug users and put them in prison. But this isn't just a problem that we faced in the 80s and the 90s, but a problem that we still face today. Tim Dickinson once again brings attention to President Obama, stating, Obama's 2017 policy was spending more than $31 billion due to acts put in its place during his presidency. The federal government is spending more than $1,100 per person to combat the habit of America's 27 million drug users, while only 22 million of those people only smoke weed. The government is not only punishing the drug users, but everyone who pays taxes is getting punished to try and fix a problem that the government themselves got into. Since weed is now becoming legal in most states, we are spending all this money to fix a problem that's not as bad as it once was. While weed isn't much of the problem, our drug rates are still rising in the U.S. a lot. With this is the rates of opiates. Opioids are described drugs and are becoming used more and more throughout America. In 2019, Christine Minhee reported that since 2000, over 300,000 people here have died from fatal opioid poisoning. This year, the CDC released that opioids were involved in 80,411 overdose deaths, which is 75% of all drug overdoses. The difference in this, rather than the beginning of the war, is that these drugs aren't just found on the streets. We see this with Catherine Neville, as she reports that 100% of hydrocodone and 81% of Oxycontin consumed by Americans were prescribed from doctors, so people are lying in order to get this drug. In order to get rid of the problem that the government got itself into once again, it's reaching into the pockets of American taxpayers. Mary Foley states that from 2015 to 2019, over $632 billion were spent to opioids. It's amazing to see how much that we are spending to not only prevent the use of this drug, but to spend because of the death of this drug. A lot of this was spent because of prisons or hospital bills, or putting people in orphanages because of somebody in their family dying from opioids. However, it's not just the opioids that are rising in the U.S. North America is now becoming the face of the drug market instead of South America. Drugs that are mainly produced in South America, such as cocaine, are becoming scarce with the rise of opioids. Maximilian Meyer wrote that once fentanyl had saturated the North American drug market, it was not long before fentanyl became the opioid of choice. She also states that concurrently, pure heroin became rare in some metropolitan areas in North America. Pure heroin doesn't have any traces of opioids in it, so we're just using opioids more and more, but we're getting rid of heroin and cocaine. Becoming the face of the drug market wasn't exactly what President Nixon had in mind during the time. The war on drugs will continue and always will be a massive failure. Nixon wanted to gain some momentum so the American people could look forward to something after the Vietnam loss. Instead, groups of people were discriminated and we are in debt. Firstly, I covered the war on drugs and how it affected people. Secondly, I covered the imprisonment in America and how much money we are spending on this war. And lastly, I covered how opioids are taking over our nation and how we are the face of the drugs market now. In conclusion, no matter how much money we continue to push towards this battle, it was lost long before we even started it.